let's talk a little bit about the research that was going on at the time that you joined the department, and we've talked about some of the faculty. What were the hot research areas in inorganic chemistry during the period from the late 50s into the early 60s, and was MIT at the forefront?
Well, Al Cotton was certainly in the forefront. He was doing very good inorganic chemistry, lots of calculations. He got into X-ray crystallography, and so he was doing really top-notch chemistry.
And what was your early research projects concerned with?
Oh, we did preparation and isolation of vinyl lithium and allyl lithium and compounds like that. Then we got into dihalocarbene chemistry by an organomercury route, which sort of got me into organic chemistry because we did a lot of carbene chemistry.
Mm-hmm. And in inorganic, Alan Davison was the next faculty member who
right.
joined after you.
He came in '64 or something like that.
Of course, he's known for cardiolite and technetium chemistry, but that was
career.
later. What was he doing initially?
He was collaborating with Dick Holm, who was at Harvard in some areas, but he started new ones. He never brought them very far. He was very innovative, very bright, and got very interesting projects going. But then he jumped into something else, and but it's really great stuff.
Hmm.
And in the organic area, Cope, much as he had a lot of other responsibilities in the administrative thing and with the American Chemical Society, he ran a high-powered research group. And I think some of the things that I'm remembering he was doing was things, I guess they called transannular reactions in medium ring, not so medium, 8-membered ring compounds where you'd have some chemical reaction on one side of the ring, and then maybe a hydrogen atom would transfer over to that spot from the other side of the ring, and a number of things in that general area were things I wish I remembered a little bit more about some of the things he was doing. George Buchy became very well known for his work in natural product chemistry, and he was elected to the National Academy of Science, so at a pretty early point in life. John Sheehan was synthesizing some of these penicillin derivatives, and that was very, very widely known work and attracted students and postdocs into the area also. Gardner Swain's work in physical organic was work that involving some standard kinds of reactions like nucleophilic substitution, and he had these push-pull mechanisms, and he was very, very active in research at that point.
He was fighting with this guy in England. Who was this?
Ingold.
Ingold. They quoted the scripture against each other.
Well, Ingold was a very famous
Ingold,
person in England in the area of physical or organic, and they did have some. Ingold wrote some really harsh criticisms of some of the work that Gardner Swain was doing, and I think that had a serious effect on Gardner. He was never quite the same person. He did write some papers that I think clarified his view of how these reactions were proceeding, but I remember that as something that was just kind of a personally devastating thing to him, which is too bad. Coming back to some of the other organic people, Herb House was in the area of organic synthesis, and I think he was doing some very fine things in the synthetic organic chemistry, and he also made a huge contribution in a textbook that he wrote on organic synthesis. And my work was in the area largely in the area of free radical chemistry, and that was going along well. I also was much interested in small ring chemistry, and sort of adventitiously got into some of these three-membered rings with two nitrogens and a carbonyl group, a diaziridinone, if one wants to put a name on it, and that was very interesting work. Some of the things that were forthcoming from the small ring. Bob Moore was doing some amazingly interesting things in small ring hydrocarbons. And I'm probably leaving out some other things along the way.
Bob Moore's contributions to gas chromatography in the department, have to mention those.
Well, I should say some more about that, because Bob Moore was a postdoc with Cope, and one meeting that Cope was over in England, and he was in touch with Lord Todd. He knew Lord Todd, and he learned that the English people, chemists, were developing this gas phase liquid chromatography, and that was quite a new thing, and it was a very, very important.
Okay, so Dietmar, you were talking about Bob Moore?
Yeah. So he designed the gas chromatographs, all home built, and I don't know, many students had one of their own. Vital in our research, but Bob really did a good job there. But he made excellent use of gas chromatography too. Separated ortho and para hydrogen, and ortho and para deuterium, which was quite sensational at the time.
And he was able to do that from this information that Cope brought back from Lord Todd's group, and the plans for how to put these things together. And Bob was an exceptionally good experimentalist, and so as Dietmar was saying, he built these things for Cope's group, but immediately the whole organic group knew that these were a huge advance in being able to separate compounds, and actually you could collect the compound off of the gas chromatographic system and get the infrared spectrum of it, or NMR of it. NMR was still at an early point, I guess, wasn't it, at that? In any event, these things, every organic group had to have these things, and there were no commercial ones for some time. So each group had probably more than one of these pieces of equipment that were built by the research group.
Was there shared instrumentation in the department at that point?
Well, there was, for things like...
What sort of
things? I'm trying to
things?
remember the NMR when that first started, when we got those things.
The A60s or the T60s.
Varian. Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, they just kept improving them, and the department would apply to the NSF for funds to get whatever the state-of-the-art NMR equipment was. And that whole field just was a burgeoning field for year after year. Big advances.
What size were your research groups in once you had been around, once you were tenured and pretty much reached a equilibrium?
So what was yours, Dietmar?
Well, mine largest was 25.
Oh, that's a And how about Al Cotton?
He had a large group, but not all that large. The organic groups were the large ones.
I don't remember the organic ones being anywhere near that number. I might be quite wrong. Would Cope have had 25? Would Sheehan? I'm thinking not. The entering organic graduate students, the first brand new ones, Cope sort of made this, didn't require this, but he certainly strongly encouraged the people to stop accepting people into their group after they'd taken maybe 3 out of an entering class of 20-ish or so for organic people, maybe not quite that many. But so So they might be adding two or three new ones to group so they could have upwards of 10 graduate students of that. 12
Well, when I say
possibly.
25, I mean graduate students
and
and
postdocs,
postdocs.
yeah.
And then the postdocs. I would say that Cope might have quite a few. Buki might have several, but and maybe I'm remembering that incorrectly. But in terms of 20, that I think would be a big group.
Was there adequate research space for everyone, or was it people cramped?
They were cramped.
Yeah. Didn't have one hood per researcher?
Oh God, no.
Not till 1970, and we moved to the new building.
Oh, that must have been interesting working in labs with people doing all the work out on the benches.
Oh, we had good lungs in those days.
Must have been interesting odors as well.
Well, the lab was big. That big room I've talked about. It had windows. The Cambridge air was not very clean. So
Well, the undergraduate laboratory in the building 2 there, where all the chemistry was based on H2S, those were really
oh heavens,
terrible, terrible, terrible.
Oh,
I can
no, I
imagine.
have no recollection of those.
Well, you mentioned the Dreyfus Building, Building 18. So what do you recall about the move into that building, or even, I mean, when you first heard that there was this, how did the discussion go with regard
Well,
to
I remember a lot.
planning of it, who planned it? Must have been something to look forward to.
I remember a lot because that was much on Cope's mind. Even in the early 60s, he wanted a new big expansion of the chemistry department to come out of the Eastman labs, what is that, Building 6?
Building 6, yeah.
Coming straight out a ways, and then a large building like the 18. But original plans were for the 18 to be basically the size that it is now, that we moved into in 1970. But there was a connector building from Eastman Court right up abutting. That was the original plan. There wasn't enough money to do that, and so the plans progressed for a building that would be what turned out to be Building 18. That was mostly Cope. That was his vision of the department, and so that was largely, I think, his doing. In terms of what groups would move into that was certainly going to be the organic group would be going into the new building. And I think, Dietmar,
I moved in.
into the top floor of that.
Right.
Or maybe not the
Not
top.
the
were
fourth
you-
floor, but you moved into the you were the first to occupy that space.
That's right.
And Corona had the whole
Corona
fifth
was
floor.
and he had the whole top floor.
Right.
He came in 1970. He came in part because of the facilities in a brand new building.
Though he was
From Wisconsin.
mainly biology professor.
He has a joint appointment,
Yeah.
chemistry and some years later he moved over into the
Right.
biology space.
But the planning and design of the Dreyfus Building would have been after Cope, since he passed away in '66 and it opened in 1970.
Yep.
I don't know if you recall which faculty might have been consulted in terms of the actual planning of the layout of the laboratories and so on.
I think the basic design of the laboratories of a perimeter corridor around it and the labs being between those inside. So there was no windows in the labs, but they had the equivalent of a hood for every person working in those labs. And there was certainly a very good safety feature that there were exits to either of these perimeter corridors. The toxic chemicals, exposure, things like that, we might come back to later, but they did have a separate room apart from the laboratory space in those labs where there were places for eating, and maybe some journals, things in that part of it. You might remember
not-
more
No,
about that.
no,
Not
that
much
came
space of
later.
that kind.
Those
Just
other
a
rooms were
little.
equipment and
Yeah.
There was
equipment
some
rooms and
equipment
chemical storeroom.
storage
Yeah,
area.
There was no place for the students to sit and eat.
yeah,
We ate in the lab.
yeah. And but I think it's hard to imagine what was in that the Greene Building, Earth, Atmospheric Planetary Science, also designed by I.M. Pei.
That's correct.
Next to Dreyfus, was built a little earlier, is that
Earlier.
right?
Right.
And the Chemical Engineering triangular building was around the same
Came
time,
later.
but a little later. But
Later,
what was
right.
in all this area?
Parking lot.
Parking lot.
Right.
It was a huge, big parking lot. And the one thing that I remember...
Just open to the street, people drove right into
Well, you
between
drive
Walker
in
and...
from Ames Street and Main Street.
Yeah.
There was a big, cyclotron of some sort. Is that the right
Yeah,
word
that's
for
right.
what was there?
No.
Which got taken down at a later point, and there was some... there was
No,
a...
it's not a cyclotron. It was Van de Graaff.
Van de Graaff, that was.
Hmm.
Then there was a very big parking lot between the library building and what's on the other side of it. Is that 56? Those buildings, that was already up.
56 and 16,
And
yeah.
That was already up. But that's a big space. And
Yes.
And I do remember one time, and we had some hurricanes. 1954, I think we had 2 hurricanes within not too many weeks separation. In any event, I do remember there were poplar trees planted all around the perimeter of this parking area. And in one of those hurricanes, they all blew down, And it was some time later, I guess, that the, what else was in there? Because, was it as late as 1970, or when they started the construction on that building, that they no longer used that as a parking area, and they built this new parking area structure, above ground structure, that was out at the corner of Ames Street and
Right.
Main Street.
Sure.
Yes.
Sure. So the Dreyfus Building, 1970.
70.
And what happened to the space that everyone who moved into the Dreyfus Building was vacating a huge amount of space in Building 6 and 2 and perhaps 4?
Well, I guess that was inorganic space, the rest of the inorganic group, and the...
I moved over to
You
Dreyfus
did, though.
Building.
You moved, but the
Yeah.
others and the physical chemists were
Sure, but
already
what happened to the space that
Well,
you
they
had
wanted-
been in?
They wanted that renovated, and it wasn't immediately, but that was part of the arrangement. If they were going to build this big new building,
Mhm.
basically for the organic and maybe some organometallic, the rest of the faculty would had to be compensated in some way by having their space also
Mhm.
upgraded.
Mhm.
I don't think that happened right off, but
I think
but
we
made
lost
s-
some space too. We lost those undergraduate laboratories, two building.
Well, Mark Wrighton was in that big space, the big lab that House, Nelson, and Greene were in earlier. At some later point, that all became a part of Wrighton's lab.
Yeah, some of it, and we also, the undergraduate office was along
On the other
in
side
Building
of
2, on the river side
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
corridor. Yeah. So let's talk about the Dreyfus Building. We said that Professor Khurana had the entire 5th floor, and Dietmar, you were on the 4th floor, is that
Right.
right? Who else was on the 4th floor?
Rastetter.
Rastetter. And third
No.
third floor, I know Fred, you were on the 2nd
I was
floor.
on the
And
second.
Professor Buki and Professor Berchtold, I think, were also on the 2nd floor.
Berchtold was at the far end of that.
And
Was
Buki
George in
between
the
you.
middle?
Yeah. 3rd floor, when I was being interviewed, Baldwin was on the 3rd floor. We haven't talked
Oh,
about
no, we
Jack
should
Baldwin.
take-
There's another colorful
Oh,
character.
Yes. Oh, yes.
I don't, what year, well,
Well,
you,
let
well,
me-
I
let me
believe
say a
you had
couple
something to do with him being hired, didn't
Well,
you?
I did. Let me go back for a moment to just complete another couple of things with regard to the Building 18, who's going where and how so. I remember hearing, and I guess Glenn Birchtold told me this, maybe Herb House. Herb House moved into the new building, but then within about a year he had this offer from what?
Georgia Tech.
Georgia Tech, and then he did leave. But he had a lot to do with one key thing about Building 18, and that was the office size. The original diagrams for office size offices in that, of course, the offices were at either end of that building, either the river end or the far end. That's where the faculty offices were. But when Herb looked at the plan of it, they were all small offices, and he said they all have to be larger. And I don't know what it was about the spacing that they realized that, at least for even allowing for some expansion of faculty, that they could all be larger. So I think Herb House was specifically responsible for all those offices being, for example, I was in the one that you are now in, and that would have been a lot smaller at an original plan for that. So that was one thing about the spacing of it. And another thing is that there was a big library on, I guess the headquarters was on the 3rd floor, river end, and then the 4th and 5th floors down in there was a library space. But it's probably less interesting to dwell on other details about that building. We could come back to it some later point, but let's go back now to what you were asking about. About Baldwin or about other
Yeah,
things
Professor
associated
Baldwin,
with
when
it.
he came on the scene and how that came about.
Well, Jack.
Well, he came and went, actually, but we'll get to that.
He did.
And came again.
Yeah.
But I was speaking down at Penn State one point in the. Let me think of when Jack Baldwin came there. It was around. It must have been near the 70s. I don't think he was ever in the older building, was he? Anyway, I won't look that up, except that I was down at Penn State, and as usual, you go around and you talk to the different faculty members in the department, and there was one new younger person there named Jack Baldwin, and in the course of that visit, I was talking with him, and I was very impressed with what he was working on. And also with his just comprehension about chemistry and things that seemed to be important to do. And I remember coming back from that visit and asking George Buchey, I said, gee, I met somebody down at Penn State who seems to be a really, really capable young person. Do you know him? He said, no, he didn't. But I knew from talking with Jack that he had come from Derek Barton, and George knew Derek Barton. Everybody knew George in the chemistry community. And so he got in touch with Derek Barton on it. And Jack had already told me that he had left Barton, that Barton wanted him to stay for another year or two as one of his, what do you call them, lieutenants? Because Barton had an empire at Imperial College at that time. And so Jack just struck out on his own to find a teaching position. And he'd succeeded, got this one at Penn State. Well, the upshot of it is that George did contact Derek, and Derek, of course, gave him an honest answer on this, that this guy was very good. And so we invited him up, and I guess everybody was enthusiastic about having him come on the faculty. And so I can't remember what year he moved there, but he was in the new building, and he was a great addition to the department.
So he was an unusual character, I think. Didn't have any hair when he joined the department,
No,
did he?
that all come out with some chemical exposure when he was working in the labs of Derek Barton, I think. So it was, but he never had a hair on his head, did he?
Hair on his body.
Oh, I see. Yeah, but I had always had a very high regard for him, both personally, and he was somebody who was, how shall I say it? How would you characterize his personality? I think he basically got along with people. He had
Called us all criminals.
Well,
Favorite word.
yes, but he was a great colleague, and I remember
An
a lot of
amusing
things.
colleague.
And if it came up to things like getting a proposal to send into the NSF, he was always very cooperative and an important part of that. He ran a big research group. The one other thing I remember about him is that he hadn't been with us too many years before there was an opportunity to move to King's College in England, and I had in free radical chemistry there were some people at King's College who were very prominent in that area, so I knew about King's College, but it was a relatively small department compared with Cambridge or Oxford or Imperial College and a few others. But he did leave MIT to go to King's College, and I don't know whether it was then he was there maybe a year or two, and it was just not a good place for someone of his abilities to be. So he asked if he could come back to MIT, and we said, sure, glad to have you come back, which he did. And then I don't know how many years he was back before he was offered the chair at Oxford, and he did accept that and go back to that. At one or the other of those things, he was, and I don't know whether it was when he was going to King's or whether it's when he was going to Oxford, where he was going to be on sabbatical leave in the spring. And I specifically remember that that when he accepted this position, he took himself off the sabbatical leave pattern. And he just came back. He was still at MIT, but he just resumed the responsibilities of a full-time faculty member rather than taking advantage of the fact he's now on a sabbatical. So I have a very high regard for him in many ways.